Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on this video. Today I'm going to do a Linux desktop roundup. This is a video that I have been wanting to do for quite some time, but it does involve a bit of setting up and preparing for, so that's why it has taken me so long to get around to doing it. One of the questions that I am asked consistently by people who are coming to Linux for the first time is, what desktop environment should I start out with? And that's a hard question to answer because it has to do with your personal tastes, and it also has a lot to do with what kind of hardware you're using, which desktop experience is going to be best for you. People who come to Linux that have been using Windows and Mac are kind of bewildered by all of the choices. And we're only going to talk about 5 desktop environments in this video today, but there's actually more to choose from than that. And the reason why there is so much choice is explained a great deal in the last video I posted called The Linux Desktop Demystified. So you can check that one out, and in that video I talk about the components of the desktop and why you can have so many different versions and variations of stuff that kind of does the same thing. When you talk about desktop computing, you really have to give credit where credit is due. Most of what is out there today is based on this concept that Microsoft came up with in 1994 and 1995, and this is called the Start Desktop. And this was a really revolutionary way to control a computer when this came along. And the components of the Start Desktop, first of all, you have icons that you can have on the desktop itself. And of course, there are the traditional windows, and every window has the same little buttons on it that do the same things, like minimize, maximize, and you can close an application by clicking the X. And then there is a menu that is down in the lower left-hand corner, and that gives you access to all of the programs installed on the computer. And in the lower right-hand corner, you have several little applets, tiny applications that allow you to monitor things on the computer or control certain things that are happening. And you usually get a clock down there and 3 or 4 other little things that you can work with. So this basic desktop idea, when desktops were being developed for Linux, was carried into the Linux desktop. And we're going to take a look at 5 different environments today. We're going to look at them in their present state. So it's not going to be like we're going to go through each one and show you what it looked like and then what it looks like now. Nothing like that. And also, I'm not going to touch on every detail that makes these desktop environments different or unique. And I'm going to try and be very objective about it. If you have a desktop environment that you like better than the other, that's great. You can express that in the comments. But don't take anything I say as being a slam on any of the desktop environments because, like I said, it really depends on your workflow and your personal tastes and the hardware you're running your Linux distribution on. So let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to start out with the king, the Grand Master, the original desktop environment for Linux. Welcome to KDE Plasma 5 point, whatever the current point is that Linux Mint is releasing with their distribution of Linux Mint that includes the KDE desktop environment, KDE Plasma. KDE stands for the K desktop environment, and it is the first full desktop environment that was available for Linux and Unix. It started in about 1996, and it has grown up in its own special way through the years, and it's very popular even to this day. A desktop environment is more than just the actual desktop that you see. It's also a group of applications, and in the case of KDE, they definitely have an entire suite of KDE applications that are available. And the desktop is really geared toward the power user. The original layout that you see when you first install it these days is quite simple, but KDE can be aggressively customized, and you can do all kinds of really crazy things with it. So let's take a look here at the system settings, And we'll just concentrate for the moment on the look and feel. So you see that we have several things that we can change about it. We can change the theme. We can change colors manually. So if you don't like a stock theme's colors, then you can create your own. You can also do a great deal with the fonts. You can choose exactly which ones you want. And then we have application style, which allows you to style the GTK applications differently than the Qt or Qt applications that normally come with KDE. KDE is based on Qt, and this is one of the things that makes it majorly different from other desktop environments that are based on GNOME, and we'll talk about GNOME shortly. KDE has a lot of very powerful and aggressive features. Here are just we can take a look here at just some of the things that you can add to the desktop environment. These little widgets, you can put them on the desktop environment. I have added the folder view, which essentially leaves a folder on the desktop because as KDE is set up when you install it, you do not have a quote-unquote active desktop. So you can't like put icons and files on the desktop like you're used to. Now that can be turned on. Like I said, KDE is extremely configurable. KDE uses one of the more interesting file managers in the Linux world, and that is called Dolphin, and it has a lot of very powerful features in it. I would not recommend KDE for somebody who is first starting out with Linux. It is very, very different from what you're used to if you're coming from Mac or Windows. It's actually difficult for me to adapt to using KDE because I have always used desktops that were based on GNOME. And since KDE and GNOME have a different path of evolution, the keyboard shortcuts and the way the buttons work is different than what you might be used to with like a GNOME desktop. So it takes a little while to get to a place where you really can be comfortable with KDE. When we were talking about KDE 3 and KDE 4 many years ago, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Those particular versions of KDE, they were very buggy, they had lots of problems, and if anybody ever asked about KDE back in those days, I'd just say stay away from it, don't touch it. However, since they have come up with the Plasma desktop KDE 5, it is actually more reliable than it ever has been, and it's become easier to work with. It has pretty good performance, as a matter of fact. So we can take a look at how much memory it's taking up here in this virtual machine by opening up the terminal, which in KDE is called console, and we'll run the free command just to see what this thing is doing. And I have opened up a few things, so this isn't just like on a first start boot, but we can take a look at it here. So we'll look at it in megabytes, and we see that the entire desktop is only taking up 490 megabytes of space. And that includes the fact that I have opened a few applications, and those applications have probably cached a little bit. So there you go. KDE. Now, I do not use KDE myself. As I said, back in the days of KDE 4, I never really liked it all that much. KDE 5, the KDE Plasma desktop, has been a better experience, and I have attempted to use it myself on 2 or 3 occasions. There are 2 things that keep me from using it. Number one, I find it to be a little bit more complex than is actually needed. Like I said, there are many settings here. There are settings up on top of settings, and there's a lot of customization that's available. So it's actually a bit too much for my tastes. The other problem that I have had with it is that I have found that just for me, it has been somewhat unstable. I set up this desktop one time, and I put this thing together and set a bunch of settings in it, and then came back a day later and restarted the computer, and all of my settings went away. So that was kind of a deal breaker for me. It tends to be, you can really tweak it, but I found that it doesn't really hang on to those settings, or things get overwritten easily, and I've also heard from Easy Linux clients that that's the case. But if you like to customize, and if you like to tinker, and you like that sort of thing, this is definitely the desktop for you. So KDE, definitely for advanced users and anybody who is in the mood to tinker with their system. Another thing I like about KDE is this menu right here, which is the kicker menu. Now this has evolved over the years. So we have all of these different choices, and this really gives you command of the entire computer. And when you open that window, if you just start typing, noticed I started typing terminal, it found that. This is a virtual machine, so there's not a whole lot of files on it. That will find files as well. So that is the KDE desktop, and that's the first one on our Roundup here. KDE, as I said, for anybody who wants to challenge themselves and they like to customize and they don't mind tweaking with it, this is definitely the desktop for you. The next desktop environment we're going to talk about is GNOME, also called GNOME by some people in the community. I have been calling it GNOME for 20 years, so that's the way I will pronounce it in this video. GNOME is a desktop that came along shortly after KDE was introduced, and it grew up in a different evolution path from KDE, and it happens to be the one that I am the most used to because my first experiences with Linux were with GNOME 2, and we're going to talk more about GNOME 2 a little bit later on. Right now we're looking at GNOME 3. The GNOME 3 desktop is very, very much different from the traditional Microsoft Start desktop that we looked at in the beginning of the video. The idea here is to make things more keyboard controlled, and the GNOME desktop uses a lot of keyboard shortcuts to make things happen. If you want to find an application on the GNOME desktop or a file on your system, then all you have to do is just click the Windows key or super key, whatever you want to call that particular key, the meta key, and then you just start typing. So if I wanted to open a terminal, then I would just start typing that, and you'll also see that it finds other files on the computer, and you can also tailor these search options. Unlike the KDE desktop, the GNOME desktop is very, very simplified in how it works. You can change desktops over here. You can see that I have several different programs running because we're in the midst of recording this video. And then you have your favorites here. You can take a look at the programs that you use often or the programs that are installed on the computer, plus the search feature is available. The widgets, there's really not much as far as widgets on the desktop with the GNOME environment. When you first install it, there really is nothing on the desktop. It won't even show icons, and that is something that you have to turn on. Most of the customizations with the GNOME desktop are done with the tweak tool, so we can take a look at that. And here's where you can customize it to fit your needs. And then a lot of the customizations are done through extensions. So here you'll see the customizations that I have installed. The GNOME desktop environment integrates with your web browser. If you're using Firefox or Chrome, you will actually have an extension running in the web browser that gives you access to all of the available extensions for your desktop. And you can actually install them through the browser. And then there are several themes available. GNOME uses GTK, and it also has, for me at least, the most familiar shortcuts. If you are somebody who has been using Linux for quite some time and you've used GNOME, it makes it difficult to go over to something like KDE for me, or maybe it does it for you too, because there are so many shortcuts that I'm used to. For instance, we talked about the super key. Well, that usually opens a menu. In the case of the GNOME desktop, it opens up all kinds of stuff. You have this activities area. But there are other things, like if I want to switch between desktops, alternate control and the up and down arrow will do that for me, and you can see the different things that are open while I'm recording this video there. And there are several of those shortcuts that I'm quite used to. One shortcut that I have to install in every single desktop environment that I use, even if I play with it, is one that usually comes with Ubuntu and Linux Mint. So if you're running Ubuntu or Linux Mint, this is usually set up for you. And that is alternate control and T, which opens up a terminal. Now I'm not going to run the free command because obviously we have lots of things open, so this would not be accurate. But from a hardware point of view, the GNOME desktop, it does suck up quite a bit of memory. Just booting the desktop itself takes over a gig of memory to run. So GNOME is better suited to hardware that has a nice video card that can handle all of the different animations, and also you want to have at least probably 4 gigs of memory in the machine, since the desktop itself is going to take up a gig. The memory that it does use is usually with caching. The GNOME desktop puts itself into memory to make itself more responsive. So it's kind of a half dozen of one, six of the other. It looks like it's taking up a lot of memory, but really what you're looking at is a lot of stuff that's cached, because when you start it up, it just loads all of this stuff into memory, which makes it run a little faster. So this is the GNOME desktop environment. Now, who would want to use GNOME? Well, the GNOME desktop environment is definitely for people who are a little bit more advanced with Linux. You'll see that it has a global menu up here. We have the activities. We have the notifications that come right here. Instead of having applets, we have this particular little window that opens up, and it gives you access to where the applets would be. That's a plugin for weather that I installed on my system. If you are running a program that has any sort of little tray icon right now, that will show up down here in this corner. I'm not running one on this desktop, so we're not seeing it. So it's a very different workflow than you might be used to if you're not used to anything else but like a start desktop, or something that you would get from Windows, or something that you would get from a Mac type experience. But one of the things I do like about GNOME is the keyboard-driven nature of it, because the kind of workflow that I do, I really like to be able to just tap and type, and I'm directly into whatever I need to be into, and I can get whatever I need to get done. As a matter of fact, I'm using GNOME now on my main machine, and I have been for quite some time. And then on all my other computers that the family uses, I'm running the Cinnamon desktop, which is a desktop that comes from the Linux Mint Foundation, and it's the one that we're going to talk about next. A couple more things to say about GNOME before we move on. Number one, this is becoming one of the most ubiquitous desktops in the Linux world. It is available on any of the major distributions of Linux. It's either offered as a choice at install, or it is the default desktop. And of course, the big news that came along earlier this year was that Ubuntu was going to stop using their in-house Unity desktop environment, and they were going to ship with GNOME 3. So there's a lot of active development going on in the GNOME world right now. The file manager that you get with GNOME is Nautilus. This has been around for quite some time, and when you compare it to Dolphin, which is what we looked at in KDE, this is a much more simplified tool. And so therefore, if you are somebody who really needs to tinker with your desktop environment, then GNOME might not be for you. You might want to go for KDE, or take a look at the Cinnamon desktop, the one we're going to talk about right now. Here's the latest Cinnamon desktop environment, and this is a desktop that was developed by the Linux Mint project after the introduction of GNOME 3. As you just saw, GNOME 3 is radically different from a more traditional desktop. And for a lot of folks, it was too much of a shock, and a lot of new desktop environments were introduced in its wake that were actually based on GNOME, and this is one of them. Cinnamon has evolved quite a bit through the years. It was originally developed around 2011, and I like Cinnamon for new users of Linux because it is a very nice stepping stone to getting into Linux if you are used to a more traditional Windows desktop. If you've used Windows 7, Windows 8 with the Aero desktop, then you're going to be really happy when you jump into Cinnamon because it's very familiar. We have a menu down here. You can place shortcuts on the menu here, and then of course we have the familiar applets over here, and they do pretty much the same things that they did in Windows. You get an active desktop right out of the box, although you do have settings where you can turn that on and off. The settings for Cinnamon are actually quite comprehensive, although not nearly as complex as what you would get from KDE. There is no need to have a separate tweak tool as you do in the GNOME desktop. You have very basic settings for GNOME that involve things like power and blanking the screen and setting up printers and things like that. And then you have the tweak tool if you really want to customize it, whereas in the Cinnamon desktop, it's all handled right here. And so a lot of folks say that coming from a Windows environment, this reminds them a lot of a control panel, and so they can get a lot of things done just with a few clicks here. So that's pretty cool as well. Linux Mint developed its very own file manager, which happens to be one of my favorite file managers in the Linux world, and that file manager is called Nemo. And Nemo is a nice balance between the total simplicity of the modern Nautilus file manager, which you will find in the GNOME desktop environment, and also in Ubuntu with Unity. They both use the Nautilus file manager, and Dolphin, which is way more complicated. It gives you a lot of different things that you can do. F3 will give you 2 windows on the screen. You can also have different tabs, and you can set up all kinds of different things that you can do here about accessing network shares and things like that. So this is really a good place for people who are starting with Linux to start out with the Cinnamon desktop. It tends to be very stable. Linux Mint actually includes a tool where you can press alternate control and backspace, and it will automatically log you out, and it will put you into the login screen, and you can log back in. So if your desktop locks up but the computer hasn't completely locked up, they give you a way to reset the system. My experience with Cinnamon, and I run this desktop on more machines than any other desktop, is that it is very stable, and I get very few complaints from folks who use it. And for a long time I used it myself, and until I started using the GNOME desktop, which seems to work a little better for my workflow at this point and the way I do things. So Cinnamon is an awesome desktop, and it's also relatively lightweight. The Cinnamon desktop will only take up probably about 500 megabytes of memory, so it works on most hardware. You do have to have a pretty good video card to make it happen. If you do not have accelerated modern video with the proper drivers, as in an older machine, then Cinnamon is a desktop that I would not recommend for you. We'll take a look at Xfce and the Mate desktops later in this video, which would be better for lower end hardware. One of the things I really like about Cinnamon is the way it handles virtual desktops, and I think they do it in a way that's better than pretty much all of the other desktops. So if I hit alternate control and then you hit the down arrow, we get what is known as expo mode here on the desktop. So let me show you what that looks like if I have more than one thing open here. So now I have a file manager and a terminal open at the same time. I just flipped myself. I flipped myself onto my. Let me see if I can regain control of the virtual machine here. Come on, why are you being this way? Okay, let me do this. There we go. Let's see what happens now. So there we go. That's what we want. And then it puts it in what's known as expo mode. Okay. So that's what that looks like when you do that. And that shows you all of the applications that are running on this particular desktop. And you can switch back and forth. Take a look here. Now, as far as getting to other desktops is concerned, it's alternate control and then the up arrow. And now we get to see all of the desktops that we have active. And we can drag one application over to the other. Things are running a little slower than ordinarily they would because this is a virtual environment. So usually it's a lot more zippier when you're using this, but you can also easily add desktops. So if you don't need 4, which is what it usually starts out with, you can just remove it by clicking the little X that pops up here. There we go. And like I said, this usually runs a lot smoother, but this is in a virtual environment, so that's why it's tending to be a little bit more sluggish and a little harder to work with. But we just removed one of the desktops, and if we need to add one, then we just click the plus, and there's no limit to how many you can have open, so it all depends on how many you want to have. Having virtual desktops is nice when you have 2 activities going at once. To switch between desktops, it's alternate control and then the right or left arrow, and it puts you back on the different desktops that you have open, and it tells you which one you're on as well, so that's pretty cool. So that is the Cinnamon desktop in a nutshell. If you don't need to have all of those virtual desktops, you can just turn it off. Cinnamon is also quite customizable. There are many themes available for the Cinnamon desktop, and the Linux Mint folks make it easy to get a hold of those themes by just clicking on themes. So you can change pretty much all the elements. You can change the window decorations, the icons, the fonts. Right now we're using the Mint Y Dark theme for this particular video. And there are many different other themes that are available that you can download. And the Linux Mint Cinnamon desktop is a GTK-based desktop. So it runs both GTK2 and GTK3 applications with absolutely no problem whatsoever. The only problem with Linux Mint is that it does sometimes have a problem running KDE applications, which are based on Qt. Sometimes that involves looking up what packages you might need to install if there are certain KDE applications that you want to run. For instance, if you are using KDE Live, which is the video editor for KDE, then you might want to look that up. Make sure that you get all of the packages that you need to actually get it to work with Linux Mint and Cinnamon. Cinnamon is available with a lot of distributions these days. It is a choice at install, or they have images available that have Cinnamon available to you. So it has become a desktop environment that is widely available, and that's what I'm trying to talk about most in this video today, are the different desktop environments that are available to you on Linux. So let's move on to a couple of more environments. We're going to look at lighter weight desktops. This desktop is actually one of my very favorites, although I don't use it on a daily basis. It is the Mate desktop. Now, before we actually get into talking about the desktop itself, we have to talk about that name, Mate. English-speaking people see it, and they see M-A-T-E, and they want to call it Mate. And the reason for the funky pronunciation is the fact that this desktop was actually developed in a Spanish-speaking country in South America. So the folks in Argentina who originally started the project, they named it after a favorite local drink called yerba mata. So the current developers, they tend to alternate between calling it mata or mate. So a lot of the tools that come with it are actually have Spanish names to them as well. This is GNOME 2 that you're looking at. This is what it looks like. When the GNOME project switched to GNOME 3, they completely changed the entire environment. This is what GNOME 2 looked like. And where we get the Mate desktop is the fact that this particular project decided that they would take GNOME 2 and they would fork it, which means that they were going to pick up where the GNOME project left off and they were going to continue with it. And this desktop environment is very popular, and one of the best distributions of Linux to experience it on is Ubuntu Mate, which is what we're looking at today, although it is available in many other distributions of Linux to varying degrees of customization. And this is the traditional layout for the Mate desktop, very similar to the original GNOME 2. We have this very simple menu here that appears in the upper left-hand corner, and you can go through the particular menus and choose applications and different settings and things like that. We have applets that live over here. It's a familiar assortment. We have a way to we have a clock there. When we click on the clock, we'll get a calendar. So this is very much a more traditional desktop. Probably reminds most folks more of like a Mac environment than anything else. No, I don't want to shut it down. Thank you very much. I was just trying to show to people how it worked. We have two panels in the traditional layout here. We'll have one on top and one on the bottom. So if we open up an application, and in this case we're opening up the file manager, which is called Caja. That is spelled C-A-J-A. I've heard some people call it Kaja, but like I said, this is a Spanish pronunciation, so the correct way to say that is Caja. And this is a very, very lightweight desktop environment. Let's jump into a terminal real quick here before we open up anything else and take a look at how much memory we're actually sucking up just running the desktop. Type that in correctly, that would help. So as you can see, we have only taken up about 333 megabytes of memory, and we actually have the file manager open and running at the same time. Kaha is fully featured. It's a fork of the Nautilus file manager, and it offers a few more features than you'll find in today's Nautilus. And one of the things that it does that I like is that you can actually split it into two different panels. These are not tabs, ladies and gentlemen. These are two windows, so you can look at two different parts of the system at the same time. Which, if there was anything in there, we'd be seeing it, but I do like that feature an awful lot. So this is Kaha, which is the file manager that comes with the Mate desktop environment. Now, another thing about the Mate environment is the fact that it is extremely customizable. You can make it look any way that you want to. And when we're talking about Ubuntu with the Mate desktop, then we get some tools that make that a lot easier. So if we go in here to look and feel, and then we open up this lovely application called Mate Tweak, you'll see that we can go to interface, and now we can look at all kinds of different layouts. Actually, it's under panel here. So let's take a look here. This is the traditional layout. Looks a lot like GNOME 2. We'll just go through the list and take a look at it. So let's see what contemporary looks like. Okay, go ahead. I don't care. We get a more advanced menu. This is a new menu that's been added to this environment called the Brisk menu. By the way, the version that we're looking at for this video is the alpha for Ubuntu Mate 17.10. So this is absolutely the latest version. Some of this will not be available if you would download, let's say, Ubuntu 16.04 with the Mate desktop on it. So let's take a look here. This is one that is supposed to kind of give you the idea that you're using the Mac OS X sort of desktop experience. It's called Cupertino. So we have the Brisk menu yet again, and then here we have a dock down at the bottom, which is a program called Plank. So if you like that sort of layout, there you go. Let's see what we have here. A very interesting one that they have is this one, which is called Mutiny. And the idea behind this is that this sort of kind of looks and acts like the Ubuntu Unity desktop. So you can get it to do that. It has global menus and all kinds of stuff in here. And we'll look at one more here. We'll look at Redmond, which is supposed to give you a kind of a more traditional Windows type desktop experience. Yes, and it opens up a more advanced menu here. So you actually have three menus available to you. You can have this one, which is the Mate menu that is pretty cool. Then they have a new menu that was developed by the Solus project, which is another distribution of Linux, and that's called the Brisk menu. So that's available in here as well. And then you have the traditional GNOME 2 type window. So whatever you want to do, you can do with this particular desktop environment. You can move things around. My only complaint with the Mate desktop environment that I've had is that there are certain bugs that have actually been in this desktop since it was GNOME 2 that as of the last time that I used it were still there. So it's like these icons here, you can add them or remove them, and you can put different programs up here. It's not just a matter of drag and drop. You have to unlock them from the panel, and then you get all of this arranged, and the next time you start the computer it'll be different. So that causes a bit of a problem for me. Now this is a minor issue, because once you have it set up the way you want it to, then it's not a problem. And as you can see, we've already had a system problem reported here on Ubuntu 17.10. But this is an alpha. I just wanted to show you the very latest Mate desktop. A lot of development going on here. So a lot of those things that I was talking about bug-wise might be already taken care of in this very, very latest version. Now another thing that you have to take into account with these, the next two desktops I'm going to show you, the Mate desktop and the Xfce desktop, is the fact that in these desktops we can choose not only the theme and the way the desktop looks and that sort of thing, but we also have the ability to change components of the desktop, like compositing. So if we come down here and look at Windows, you'll see that I have the ability to change my compositor, which is what handles all of the lovely animations. So we have several choices, and the one that I usually end up using for this is called Compiz. You saw that we had a little garbage come up on the screen, so this is what Compiz looks like when it's running. And now we get some different actions. So if I go to switch desktop environments, I get a nice animation, which I wasn't getting before. So if we switch back to a simpler desktop and compositor, let's do Marco GPU. We change that, give that a second to settle in. Now you can see that when I go to switch between desktops, we get a much different thing going on there. So all of this is handled by that environment. So this is what alternate tab looks like, just a little something there. Let's switch it back to Compiz. Give it a second to settle in. Now you'll see we have a much different alternate tab sort of thing going on here. And then you can also turn off the compositor entirely if you want to, and that might be something that you'd want to do on very, very low-end equipment. So you have more things to mess with here, but you also have the ability to make this work well on lower resource equipment. Or on the flip side of that, you could have a very powerful machine that had a very powerful video card, and it had a lot of memory and lots of CPUs to work with, but then maybe you want to have a desktop environment that doesn't suck a lot of that up, so you can leave it for your programs like your video editor or your games or something like that. So it's a very flexible desktop environment, the Ubuntu Mate environment, just the Mate desktop. It's available on a lot of distributions. Now, some of these tools that I have just shown you here, they're not necessarily available on other versions, but you won't get lost either way that you go. And this is now available to run on most of the major distributions in one way or another. So very nice, old-fashioned Linux traditional desktop. And when we first started out in Linux, I know that when I started out in the mid-2000s, this was it, babe, right here. GNOME 2, the Ubuntu Mate desktop. And, I gotta say that the Mate project, especially the Ubuntu Mate project, is headed up by two of the coolest guys in the Linux world, and that is Martin Wimpress and Alan Pope. They're just super, super guys, and just do not fit the image of the average computer nerd, and they're very responsive to their community. It's very, looking at the Ubuntu Mate project, that it really is a model of how an open source project should be done. So had to throw that in there before we move on to the next desktop environment, which will be Xfce. The next and last desktop environment we're going to be talking about here in this video is Xfce, also called by some people Xfce. This project has been around for quite some time. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head what year it started, but it has been around for a good long time, and it is a very stable and very well respected desktop environment for Linux. It's Xfce. Now, I find this to be extremely good for people who really, really liked the Windows XP experience. Anybody who used Windows XP will gravitate toward Xfce. Xfce is very, very lightweight, and it offers quite a bit of settings that you can mess with, but it's not really like a huge amount of settings. So if we take a look here, we'll see how much memory we've taken up just booting up the desktop and opening up the menu. And it looks like that we are only using about 281 megabytes. Xfce comes with its own compositor, which is already usually set up when you install the system, but different implementations of Xfce from different distributions might allow you to use different compositors. That is in there as well. This menu is actually a very nice one indeed. You have categories over here, and then over here you will have the applications. You can set the menu to either tell you a generic name for the application, like web browser, or the actual name. Up top here, you can set that up, and this menu is highly, highly customizable. Looking through the system settings, they are quite comprehensive. Not quite as comprehensive as what you would get from KDE or the Cinnamon desktop environment, but most of everything that you're going to need is available here. The Xfce desktop environment is very, very, very elastic, and you can do all kinds of crazy customizations. You can add panels, you can put all kinds of things all over. Now that just popped up has to do with the fact that this is running in a virtual machine. That's not part of the Xfce desktop. That's part of the VirtualBox hypervisor. This is how you would log out of the system from Xfce. And now this settings menu doesn't necessarily have everything that you need. So usually for some things you might have to go do a search for it. Searching for a program is really quite easy. If I do terminal, you'll see that it pops up, and not only that, it gives me a couple of choices here. So we can open up the Xfce terminal, and that's what it looks like. Now, one of the things I have neglected to mention is that a lot of these desktops I have customized a little bit, because these are actual machines that I use all the time. So when you first install it, it doesn't necessarily look like this, but I just figured I would mention that somewhere along the way. The file manager that you get in Xfce is Thunar, and Thunar is a very nice file manager. Doesn't have the split screen option that I like, but you can do tabs, and it is a good basic file manager for most people who are using Linux. And Xfce also offers the ability to have multiple desktops. So you can switch with a mouse with a desktop switcher on the panel there, or you can just use the same GNOME-based shortcuts. And we are switching desktops even though we can't see we're doing it. I would probably, let's open up an application here and then we'll switch desktops, and then you'll be able to see, yes, we are actually switching desktops. And the little indicator shows you down there what's going on. And you can have as many of those as you like. And some different Xfce implementations come with this little application already here. And they usually start out with 2 or 4 or something like that. One of the things I like about the Xfce compositor is when you actually switch between applications. The alternate tab function is one that I particularly like. And that is, if you do that, you get this lovely large preview of exactly what's on the screen for each application. And then it will do the traditional things, like you can put the desktop into quadrants. Most desktops will do all of this stuff. Xfce is very, very lightweight, and it is a desktop that I have used myself for quite some time. Some folks that have used Xfce have told me that they've had some screen tearing issues, that it doesn't quite render exactly right with the compositor. There are some things in there that you can tweak. They were having problems with games and video, and it wasn't quite working the way it was supposed to, but that may be a driver issue. I personally never really ran into any major issues with that. There's a setting in here where you can change it to make it do that. Or make it so it won't do that, where it synchronizes, and this is not doing it here in this video. And as a matter of fact, this is extremely responsive, and this is running in a virtual machine that has exactly the same power as the Cinnamon virtual machine that we were looking at earlier, and you guys saw how that looked as far as things opening up and being quite sluggish with the desktop, and whereas Xfce is just moving right along. Xfce was kind of sort of the standard desktop that came with Arch Linux and Manjaro and those flavors of Linux for a while there. I think they're moving away from that. The only problem with Xfce at this point in time, there's always questions about its development. It is on GTK2. They haven't moved to GTK3 yet. And the project itself, there's always questions about whether there's enough interest in Xfce to keep it going and modernize it. Whereas if you take what's going on with the Mate desktop environment, they're moving almost exclusively to GTK3 right now, so they're really moving forward, and there's a lot of development going on. Not quite so much with Xfce. But if you don't care about those sorts of things and you just want a computer that's going to run and be very stable, then Xfce is definitely a good choice. And the one that's offered from Linux Mint, the Linux Mint distribution, is excellent. Some people really like Xubuntu, also called Xubuntu, which is a flavor of Ubuntu that comes with Xfce. It's also available from OpenSUSE, and it's available as well from Fedora. So whatever flavor of Linux you want to try, you can give Xfce a try. This is a great desktop for very low resource hardware. So if you're trying to run Linux on a machine that's 10 years old, and let's say that you only have a gig of memory in it, and you have an old 40 gigabyte hard drive, and you have an old Intel video card that maybe has 128 megabytes of video memory available to it, you can actually run Linux and it'll work. And it's more usable than you would believe. My brother actually runs a machine that's a Dell Dimension 3000 with very similar specs there, although he was able to boost it to 2 gigs, and he does everything he needs to do on a computer on a lower end machine like that, and he loves the Xfce desktop. He just liked it because he was coming from a Windows 95, 98, 2000 XP sort of groove. He had never used Windows 7. He was used to that, so when we switched him over several years ago when XP lost its support, he just fell in love with it, and he's been using it ever since. So yeah, very nice desktop indeed, the Xfce environment. Just some closing thoughts on this particular video. We have looked at all of these different desktop environments, and you have got my opinions on them as we rolled along. Of course, there are many details about each one that we could not get into. The idea behind this video was to just give you a look and give you some of my thoughts on the environment. Which one you choose is going to depend a great deal on your hardware and which one of these look the coolest to you. Which one of these do you think that if you're starting out with Linux that you want to live in all the time and make it your computing experience. Each one of these desktops has pluses and minuses. Each one has their own little quirks, and sometimes they have bugs that lurk in the background. Each one of these is this way. There's not one that's perfect. So what works for you may not work for the next guy, and vice versa. So I do hope this video helped, and if you are somebody who is trying to get somebody interested in Linux, why don't you share it with them? Why don't you show them what the desktops look like? Also, I do want to reiterate once again that performance issues that I had with, let's say, the Cinnamon desktop here in this video, they do not apply to the real world simply because it's running in a virtual machine, and when you're running things in virtual machines, sometimes they don't look as zippy as they would be on actual hardware. But as you can see, everything seems to work fine with 2 gigs of memory. So just to recap real quick, we'll talk about KDE and GNOME, the 2 biggies there. Those desktops require that you have a computer with at least 4 gigabytes of memory, and you do want to have a nice video card to take full advantage of them. The Mate desktop, that desktop is good for low resource hardware. It is not quite as lightweight as, let's say, Xfce or even something like an LXQT or an LXDE. We did not look at that desktop environment in this video, but it works nicely on, modest hardware. I would say that you would need to at least have 2 gigs of memory and a nice video card. Cinnamon desktop, bare minimum 4 gigs to get full performance out of it, although it's not nearly as memory hungry as, let's say, a straight GNOME 3 environment. It does require that you have pretty good video to do all of the animations and things like that and make it very useful. And then finally with Xfce, that takes the least resources of all the desktops that we looked at, and it is very good on old hardware, and it's good on new hardware as well if you just like the idea of not giving a bunch of your resources to the desktop environment and you'd like to give that to your applications. Video performance on all of these desktops is a combination of the drivers and the settings and what compositors are being used and other applications, and it varies widely depending on your hardware. So you may find that with your particular computer you start out with Xfce and your video is a little laggy and you have screen tearing issues, while if you go to the Cinnamon desktop environment or you go to the GNOME desktop environment, that everything is flawless, even though the desktop is taking up more memory and demanding more from the video card, you might find better performance. I've seen that happen time and time again. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons I'm not using Xfce on this machine that I'm recording this video on, is because it just does not take full advantage of the hardware that's on the machine. So that is something to definitely keep in mind. KDE, that is a desktop that I would recommend for people who love to tinker, who love to customize, who love to be in control of their computer and want to set it up exactly the way they want it to be. It has come a very, very long way in the last few years, but it is still somewhat cantankerous in places. And KDE is available on a lot of distributions of Linux. The KDE project even has their own distribution called KDE Neon, which is based on Ubuntu 16.04. So to get the full updated KDE experience, you could start out with Neon, but most major distributions also offer it as it's an option. And Linux Mint has a very nice KDE implementation, which is what we saw in this video. So thank you for watching. Do check out Easy Linux on the web. Check out Easy Linux on Facebook, and also check out freedompenguin.com for lots of stories about Linux. We will do it again soon.